Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ICG's Digital Academy webinar series. I'm Sally Alsop, the ICG committee member responsible for the ICG webinar programme. Next slide, please. Sorry, it was my screen. So for today's webinar, we're delighted to welcome ICG member and owner of The Outsiders, Stephen Lacey. Steve is an ex-strategist and an award-winning qualitative researcher. He is both disabled and neurodiverse and conducts lots of research in the diversity space. I should add that Steve hides his light under a bushel somewhat, as a quick review of his ICG profile shows he was winner of the MRS Best Cultural Insight Award in 2022, the MRS Best Creative Development Research Award in 2022, the MRS Best International Research Award in 2021, and the MRS Bravery Award in 2016. And if you have 5 minutes to spare, take a look at the Outsiders website and run the intro film with the sound on. It's a very, very powerful sales pitch. So well done there, Steve. I was quite impressed. So in this ICG webinar, Steve will tell us about his own life and personal challenges, and then he'll talk more generally about the lives of those with disabilities, the barriers they face, and what brands can do to support them. He'll also be sharing some tips on the best way to conduct research, how to represent people with disabilities in marketing, and how to create good innovation. So Steve has said he's happy to take questions both after the first part of his presentation, where he'll be talking about himself, and then at the end. So if you'd like to ask any questions, please either turn your webcam on and raise your hand, or else type your comments in the question box or chat box. Next slide, please, Steve. So this webinar is generously sponsored by McGowan Transcriptions, a leading digital transcription agency in the UK since 1993. They specialise in providing accurate and confidential multiple voice transcriptions to various industries, including the market research, medical and legal sectors. Their services prioritise quality control and security, which is especially crucial in fields where accuracy and confidentiality are essential for research and analysis purposes. Next slide, please, Steve. Before I hand over to Steve, here are some more events we have planned for you over the next few weeks, quite a few of them focusing on AI, which is very in vogue at the moment. Don't forget that we're able to offer great value sponsorship opportunities with each of our webinars and online events. Just contact Lucy if you want to know any more about that. So next slide, please. I'll now hand over to Steve.
Hello, everyone. So it's great to be here. So as mentioned, I'm going to start a little bit with my kind of personal kind of experience. And I think we have to be careful because it's my own personal experience. So I can't speak for every person who's kind of got a disability or is neurodiverse. But I think hopefully by being kind of vulnerable and kind of open, it will make people think and maybe have some kind of reflections on some of the kind of issues I'm going to speak to. After that, I will then talk a little bit about the barriers that people with disability face based on lots of research that I do for people such as Mars and the Cabinet Office, and also kind of Essity. I'll talk about communications, generally about diversity communications, but then I'll narrow it down to the disability field, and then I'll talk a little bit about research and a little bit about kind of innovation. So a little bit about myself. So I've got what's called a lobster hand. I've got a missing fibula and a shortening of a tibia in 2 legs. So my legs are kind of bowed. Got 2 toes on one, 4 on the other, and I'm neurodiverse. So I'm dyslexic. I'm having tests for ADHD as well, because I've gone back to university. So I'm having some tests to see whether I've got ADHD as well. So this is a topic really important to me. When I was born, the doctors said I'd never walk. I was brought up in a very rough kind of council estate in the middle of Felsham, and my mum used to make me walk and get up by myself, and people used to spit her in the street and say, how can you do that to a disabled child? And I was very blessed that I had very kind of strong parents, and they encouraged me to do everything. So I was did martial arts. I was in kind of Combat Magazine, played football, used to do swimming, played water polo, and they pushed me into a good education. So I ended up into a good school through kind of a scholarship. Ended up as president of my student union, and then kind of worked in research and advertising. So in terms of barriers, I mean, I was quite lucky, and more lucky than a lot of people, because I've been pushed into to kind of exceed. And I remember my parents saying to me that if you imagine God plays a game of cards, there's certain cards you can play with, and there's certain cards you can't, and you just have to ignore the cards you can't and play well with the cards you kind of can. But I definitely felt that I had some kind of barriers put into my place. I remember when I was younger, I went on a TV program called Your Shout, talking about temp agencies, because when I used to go in the summer to try and get a job in a temp agency, my friends would go in and there'd be loads of jobs available, and then I would go in and there'd be no jobs available. And through the interview process, I always had big debate whether to disclose or not to disclose. When I didn't disclose, it was always a little bit of a kind of shock. And when I did disclose, I didn't always necessarily kind of get the kind of interviews, or felt I got the interviews. And I remember even recently, probably about 10, 15 years ago, I went for an interview, and I was sitting in a room and on a long table, and the managing director come in, and we did the interview, and he didn't notice my disability, which was a bit strange. And then at the end, I got up and he was like, "Oh, what's wrong with you?" So you kind of get that kind of microaggressions, a little bit of kind of negativity. But I'd say my biggest barrier is really dyslexia. So having dyslexia has always made me feel, in many ways, kind of quite stupid. I remember working for one agency, I won't say who it is, and as a kind of freelance, and they wanted to take me on full time. They're like, "We like the fact you're dyslexic because you think differently." And it just didn't work out, because they started structuring me into a box, and I found that very, very difficult. And then I went to another company, and they did, in the reference, they told them I was dyslexic. So there is negativity out there, and I think in many ways, a bit coming from working class roots as well, I've always thought that I'm kind of blagging it, and it's only in the last few years that my kind of confidence has kind of risen, and I've kind of accepted that I am good at kind of what I do. So these are, before I start, I'm going to do some observations on kind of how I think people interact with me in terms of disability and neurodiversity. But I always like to do a free to the floor. So you can ask me any questions, any personal questions, and I will answer them. And don't be afraid, there's no stupid questions. So just seeing if anyone's got any questions. Oh, quiet. Any questions?
Hi, Steve. Sorry,
Hi.
I've just turned my camera off. Hi, it's Judith Stag here.
Hi.
How are you?
Oh, hi.
I've got a personal question. What do well-meaning people who really are trying to, be really considerate and lovely, what do they get wrong?
They don't ask. Sometimes you get two directions. It's a really hard one, Duke, and a really good question. So on one hand, they don't ask at all when you really need help, like when you're on a suitcase going up the stairs, and they're scared, and they're like, "We can't ask questions anymore because we might offend." And on the other hand, they ask at the wrong time. And it's just an education process, and it's just asking people, "Would you like any help?" And then you can say. I mean, I always welcome. I always think people are very, very kind. And the interesting thing I've spotted, public transport is really difficult. And I always found that the city workers would always put their newspaper up and ignore you. And actually, people from ethnic minorities and working class would always offer you their seat. And that's a broad generalisation, but it was quite interesting in itself. Joe.
Joe's got a question, yeah.
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for this and for being open and honest. And I'm dyslexic and dyspraxic myself, and a researcher. So it's nice to hear this conversation starting to happen in the industry. Seeing some posts on LinkedIn where people are starting to talk about it. And one of my questions for you really is, as a business owner and as someone who's gone through interview process and aware of what your neurodiversity brings for you, how would you advise employers to amend or design job specs that encourage neurodiversity in their workplace, or encourage neurodiverse people to apply and not be off-put by some of the things they might struggle with, I guess?
It's a really good question. I think a lot's about the selection process. So I remember doing kind of diversity training, and this was actually someone internal who was brilliant at their job, and they were dyslexic, and they wanted to go for promotion, and they went into the interview, and they were a completely different person. Yeah, and I think allowing people to see the questions in advance, understanding the beauty of neurodiversity, and actually it's going to be a kind of strong benefit, and then having things put in place. So when I worked in advertising, I worked at Farm Communications, and the bosses there, they just said, look, you've got weaknesses. Everyone's got weaknesses. Like, play to your strengths. We can get a proofreader in to deal with the stuff. We can get a visual designer in. We can have an account handler to help you a bit on the disorganization front. Don't worry about that. Just play to your strengths. And I think that's a really good thing. And having a business, that's how I run my business. I play to my strengths. But I have Judith who does lots of stuff for me, lots of my proofreading and writing, so who's absolutely fantastic. And then I have other teams that are good at the kind of admin side and stuff that I'm very chaotic on. And that allows me to then focus on my strengths without the kind of stress. Because it's really interesting. I don't know about yourself, Joe, but for me, if I've got to do tax or administration or forms, my brain just shuts down and I don't panic. And it will take me a day of absolute, and I will be absolutely exhausted. You can give me a debrief to write, yeah, or complicated problem, and I'll be fine, yeah?
Yeah.
You give me a form to do or a screener, and I'm just like, I don't know. It's just like most stressful process of my life. So I think it's just acknowledging that fact and allowing people to work with you.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Thank you.
Steve, can I ask a quick question?
Cool.
We are talking much more now about disabilities and diversity and neurodiverse people. Are you seeing any changes, any shifts in people's attitudes, and is life becoming easier for people with disabilities? Or
it's a really difficult one to judge. So in the workplace, I would say yes. There's still not enough disabled people in the workplace. One of the problems a lot of employers have is they think there's going to be high costs associated with it. And the cost of adjustment, you get grants anyway, but the cost of adjustment is £80 on average for people with disabilities. So it's not long. And so I think there's still not enough disabled people. It's slightly improving. I remember when I was in advertising, I think that was the thing. I had no role models, so I had no one to kind of look up to, which was strange. So I think there is a ceiling going. There's a lot of hate crime. The hate crime's actually increased on disability. So actually in society, it's actually got worse, which is worrying. And I think a lot of that comes from the socio-economic climate. I think the culture war, this idea of invisible disabilities, you've got your blue badge, you're not really kind of disabled, you're kind of a scrounger. All these kind of stereotypes, I think, fuel a degree of kind of hate at the moment. So it's good, and it's better than most countries. So I've done work kind of globally on disability, and it's definitely better than most, but there's still work to be done.
the hate crime, is that mainly through social media, or is it physical?
Both actually. Social media, it can be physical. It can be abuse for parking your car with a kind of blue badge and people don't think you're kind of disabled. It can be kind of little microaggressions, but it's mainly it can be quite horrific. There's definitely a slight rise. I think that's a function of the time we're in at the moment, unfortunately. So I'm going to give you, so these are some of my viewpoints, and they're only mine, and I'll quickly go through them, and I'll send this around so you've kind of all got it. So I think this is some of the things I've observed. So people often say, oh, wow, you're really, really strong. And it's like, yeah, that's nice, but I'm just me. Yeah, it's like I don't really need that kind of confidence. I'd often be always happy and always smiling. And even when my mum died, I was always kind of smiling, because it was like, as a disabled person, you don't want to be pitied. So you have to kind of go into the binary kind of opposite. I get, I obviously get stared at quite a lot because of my legs. I never noticed that, which is strange until I started doing diversity training. And then suddenly I started picking it up. I was kind of oblivious to it, but a lot of other people would kind of notice it. Children always ask what's wrong with you. And I actually find that's quite refreshing because once you tell them that you're born with it, etc., then they're your best friend. It's really interesting. You just break a barrier. But often parents won't want their children to ask the questions, and I find that a shame. Adults will often turn their heads away, not give eye contact if they don't know me. Adults, as I mentioned earlier, will sometimes say, "What's wrong with you?" Sometimes when I go into a shop and with someone else, they will talk to the person who I'm with and not me. And that's quite common in disability. You see that a lot, especially with people in wheelchairs or visually impaired. People will often just completely ignore them and think the person's the carer. As I mentioned, being dyslexic often makes me kind of sick. I would hide my dyslexia. I'd not tell people I was dyslexic, which created massive kind of mental kind of energy and energy drain on me because I'd find this was the days before the amazing Grammarly. But so now the beautiful thing about Grammarly is I can see 100 of my clients' mistakes when it comes through on an email, which always gives me great satisfaction. But I'd always try and hide it with kind of spell check. Disability would often be central focus. There's a big feeling that disabled people. I worked in the Maltesers campaign that they're asexual and they don't have sex, which is a complete misnomer. But there is this kind of real kind of negativity in this big myth, and I want to look at kind of dating sites and do some work around this about whether this has changed, but I don't think it has. I don't have an opinion on every disability issue, and I think that's like every diversity. So sometimes people ask me, I've never lived with a hearing impairment, never been visually impaired, so I don't really understand that. People make fun. So my best friends would call me things like Penguin and Captain Hook, but I allowed them and it didn't bother me, and I would give it back. And it was kind of working class way of term endearment. So for me, I gave permission to that. But if it's a stranger doing it, it's a very different perception. I'm not an angel. I do have a dark side. Sometimes I've noticed people kind of speak kind of slowly to me. As mentioned on the train, it can be kind of difficult. It's exhausting, constantly breaking down barriers. And as mentioned, there's good kindness and kind of bad kindness. It's just asking. And I think an important point, and I'll come to this later, is that disability is part of my identity and it's a part of my jigsaw, but it's not the defining part of my jigsaw. There's lots of other elements to my story. And I think sometimes the focus can be, this is just Steve and this is just Steve's kind of life. So let's talk a little bit more about kind of disability. So just some kind of stats. I think it's 14.1 million people in the UK have a disability. I read somewhere that neurodiversity is now 20%, so which I think is interesting. 8 out of 10 people aren't born with it, so most people acquire it, and not everyone will say they're disabled to acquire it. So a lot of elderly are actually disabled, but they won't actually see themselves as kind of disabled. 75% of people have more than one impairment, so I have multiple impairments. What's interesting is when you get that multiplier effect of a person with disability or neurodiverse and their family and friends, you're suddenly coming up to 30%, 40% of the population. And I think that's really interesting. When I tell clients that, they get interested because when I had a bad experience at Thorpe Park and they wouldn't let me on the ride, none of my family would go to Thorpe Park. Yeah. So there's a magnifying effect that's really, really important. Sadly, there's more clothes made for dogs than people with disabilities. So, and that's an interesting kind of more emotional kind of fact. The business effects are the figures are big. So the purple pound's worth a lot of money globally, but there's not a lot of good things. So businesses are losing approximately £2 billion a month. 75% of disabled people and their families have walked out from a business because of poor accessibility or customer kind of service. So what are the kind of barriers that people face? And I'll do neurodiversity kind of separately, but visually impaired people, it can be really difficult getting out of the home. I speak. I think this is one of the few examples that I hear, and that's often women who are visually impaired will be grabbed by men. So they'll be on a train, for instance, and a man will just grab them, yeah, or a man will just grab hold of them, and they feel they have to grab them and guide them. And I can't think of any other woman that would be allowed to kind of do. There's been problems with visual impaired with taxi drivers refusing if they have a kind of guard dog. It's not enough accessible information, so they can often feel cut off from kind of society. When they're shopping, they struggle to kind of find things, even if they've got partial kind of vision. Often the websites, which they rely on heavily. I don't know if you've ever done work with visually impaired people, but the way their technology works is absolutely amazing. But not everything's accessible. TV ads and programs need good descriptions, and they're not there. Hearing impaired is interesting. I think they worry a lot about meeting new people, and they can often get verbal abuse because they don't always wear kind of hearing aids. When they're in a cinema or restaurant, if there's no hearing aids, they can be lost. But one of the important things about people with hearing impairments is if you lose eye contact with them, they can't follow the conversation. And that's so important. And that's something I'm aware of when I do disability research, that the eye contact has to be there. The mask, when we're having a mask, made it an absolute nightmare for them because they couldn't lip read, so they couldn't see at all. Need good subtitles to watch TV. Physically, often in constant kind of pain, difficult kind of access. They have to plan a lot in advance, but I think all people with disabilities have to plan, and that taxes the brain. So they will plan when to shop, when's the best time to go on the tube, when to avoid certain crowds, when to do this, when to do that. So it's a lot of scheduling, and the more scheduling that you do, the more your energy drains. So a lot of people with disabilities will be physically kind of exhausted often, and I think that has to be taken in mind. Those in wheelchairs, people often bump into them if they're in shops, for instance. They can't access upwards and access all the kind of shelves. Just some more kind of stats. I won't do loads of stats. I'll send these around, but I'll just pick out some interesting ones. So 43% abandoned shopping tasks. This is from Disability Business Forum. 65% agreed. I feel like my choices of what to buy are limited on a daily basis due to kind of barriers. So you can see these barriers, and we will send these through so you can express them a bit more. So why is disability and neurodiversity important? Well, it's reflective of society. Disability is the largest diverse group, but it's probably the most ignored, and it's probably the one that's most invisible, and it's probably the one that has the least weight of conversation. It might be your staff. Some of your staff may be disabled or may be acquiring disability, because many people will come through. I think when you talk about diversity and inclusivity, what it does is it creates a degree of kind of what I call brand warmth. And in a world where there's little USPs or ESPs, having that little bit of point of difference to others creates a halo effect of warmth around your brand, which creates a differentiation. You make better products. So if you design for the edges in terms of innovation, you'll often deal with the problems in the center. Strong social currency, people will talk about it and can help increase your sales. So when I worked on the Maltesers ad, which was a girl who's disabled talking about sex with a group of friends, it's the best performing ad that Mars have had in 20 years in terms of sales. And also, I think there's a social purpose that creates hope for people. There's a shift in approaches. There's very much an old model, which was you had to fix the individual and you had to correct the kind of deficit. So it was very medicalized, and it was people with disabilities, the research subjects, or they're the patient. The new model is people aren't disabled, you're disabled by society, and we have to strip those kind of barriers away, and that's much more kind of positive space. So a little bit about kind of neurodivergence and my views on neurodivergence. So neurodivergent refers to the idea that there's neurological kind of differences, such as those seen in autism or ADHD. Neurodiversity is a spectrum, and we can cut across that spectrum in different kind of ways. And you have neurotypical on one side, which is more not on the spectrum side, but on the other side. There's a range of conditions, and I think it's interesting because most people think of dyslexia, most people think of ADHD, but autism falls into that. Developmental language disorders, Tourette's, will all fall into the realm of neurodivergence. Neurodivergence, there's a lot of debate within the community. Is it a disability or is it a superpower? That debate, like a lot of debates, is an internal debate. It's not being formed, and people will have different perspectives on it. In the same way as language, people often ask me about language. I tend to officially use people with disabilities. I don't mind being called disabled. Some people dislike it. For me, it's a word that I'd like to own. But again, there's a lot of debate, and it's still being debated and developed about what is the most appropriate kind of way kind of forward. It often refers to autism. Not all neurodivergent individuals are alike. So one person with autism could be very, very different to another person with autism. So it's a spectrum. So those differences can be quite different. There's often a myth they cannot or do not want form relationships, which is completely untrue. So I think we'll talk about the myths a little bit later, but there's that kind of myth that they're kind of distant and can't create kind of bonds with others. As beings don't have empathy, and autistic people will often say that neurotypical people don't have empathy. So, which I think is interesting in itself. They don't have intellectual disabilities, so I think there's a feeling that they've kind of got intellectual kind of disabilities, and there's a feeling they can't succeed, which is a myth. And it's interesting, actually, when you look at Silicon Valley is hiring lots of people that are neurodivergent. Yeah? So a lot of their hiring process is around that, because they can realize that people are either incredibly creative or they be good at certain kind of subjects in very, very strong degree. Believe they don't have strong kind of communication skills, abnormal, so that they make loud or inappropriate kind of gestures. And then you get different myths for different conditions. So dyslexics are always often seen as kind of stupid, you're illiterate, you can't smell. ADHD, you're seen as kind of being lazy or flaky. Autism is always projected as being kind of geeks or antisocial, or they're quiet, or they're kind of weird. And people with dyspraxia, although I don't think most people know about dyspraxia in the same degree, are often seen as kind of clumsy. So how does it impact on their life? This can change from different people, like all kinds of disability and neurodiversity, but ADHD might not be able to concentrate as much if they have ADHD, or they may over concentrate sometimes. So they can become quite obsessive about certain kind of things. Sometimes we'll be moving around quite a lot. Time structure can be kind of different. So they might want to work at 3 a.m., not kind of 9 to 5. And sometimes memory can be difficult. So often people will sometimes record things into a dictaphone. They might not always be able to follow kind of orders. Might dislike crowds, and I think this is an interesting one. You could sometimes observe it in train stations. Some people will have headphones on because they can't handle the amount of sound that surrounds them in a crowded kind of space, and they sometimes can lack social abilities, but not always. That's not a set rule. It can be very sensitive to sensory environment. So they won't necessarily eat specific food. Certain kind of clothes can hurt their eyes. I remember when I was working on phone care, one of the things we saw was the certain kind of packages, the bright packages, could have a real big impact. Changes in store, actually for disability as well, is a nightmare. Because you're so used to shopping in a certain kind of way, a change can be really, really kind of disruptive and takes more kind of mental kind of energy. And a lot of disability people I speak to are what I call ninja shoppers. They just go in very, very quickly. They have a list. They know where everything is, and they want to get out as fast as kind of possible. Light for people that are autistic can give them kind of headaches. The filters and sensory thing is really, really important. Tourette's can sometimes make noises. And you've got Williams syndrome, which is they're often very kind of sociable, but don't always like loud noises as well. Neurodivergents can find it hard sometimes to have relationships, and some can find it difficult to have friends. But then you get the other side that can be very kind of outgoing and kind of out there having lots of kind of conversations. When it comes to shopping, you need to plan everything in advance. Familiarity is very, very important. So kind of go to the grocery store to know where everything is. Can become fixated on one thing in kind of stores. So people talk to me, I'm very interested in a certain kind of plastic kind of bottle and only pay attention. And there's a bit of attention, like all of us really, but they often like novelty and familiarity that is kind of combined. So what we found really in Femcare was the packaging and the brightness of the packaging really kind of off. People found it really kind of off-putting, and there's not enough help on packaging, so for disability either. So should be much more things in terms of kind of braille, etc. So let's talk a little bit about representation and disability and neurodiversity. So it's improved, and it was great to see the Eurovision with lots of people with disabilities as a backup, and you're seeing more and more on TV, which is a fantastic thing to see, and seeing that is important, because I think when I've done lots of work in diversity, the one thing that people struggle the most with is talking to people that they're not used to talking to and never encountered before. So people don't get scared and don't always know the right language to use, the right things to say. So the more the representation is out there, the more people are going to get used, and that will create a societal kind of change. But they're often seen as villains. So Hollywood, TV, most of the villains have disabilities or mental health problems. Even people like Trump, yeah, you could argue that potentially has, but yeah, I didn't like that. A lot of the language they used was the language of mental health around him. I think it creates problems in itself. But there's something about villains are always seen as people that are kind of disabled. Social media is improving, much more kind of disabled voices. TikTok is a game changer. If you want to understand disability and how it's changing, look at TikTok, because there's so much great kind of content on there. The content's shifted. So originally content was much more about disability, but now it's about passion points. I like badminton, or I like swimming, or I like chess, or whatever you're doing. The problem is the algorithm. So sometimes content's still not getting pushed out enough. So often it can be stuck in kind of an echo chamber and not pushed out enough. And sometimes the media companies can actually cut off content which they think is offensive, and it's not. It's just someone talking about a reality of kind of life. So I'm going to step back a little bit here and talk about communication, some general kind of rules in terms of diversity and how I see kind of ads and communications kind of working. I think the first thing is advertising agencies are often lazy and they jump. So what you'll often see is, here is a problem we've got, and we're going to do the opposite. So lesbians are butch. So what we're going to do is we're going to show them super pretty with kind of tattoos who don't smile. People with bigger bodied women are always sad. So we're going to show them happy, jumping with joy. Neurodiversity are idiots. So we're going to show them as genius. Physical disability, we're going to show them as superhumans. Muslims are always fundamentalists, so we're going to show them as happy shopkeepers. No diverse audience I speak to likes this type of representation. They want to be normalized. They don't want to be put into this extremity. I understand why ad agencies go there, because it's like, here's a problem, let's jump, right? But it's not what people want. People want a normalization of a representation, not an extremity. I think the next thing is always be true to your kind of tone. People ask me a lot about authenticity and how do you do authenticity well. And for me, it's about the spirit of the brand. So when I worked on Maltesers, everything they did is about the light side, yeah. So everything's done in a sense of humor, which makes it feel true and authentic. Every Nike ad will be in the spirit of just do it. I think when it feels outside your tone, it feels wrong. The next thing is be true be true to what you're talking about, and don't look like you're jumping on a bandwagon. It has to run through the veins of the company. So when I worked on Maltesers, when they first did this, they did it through a Channel 4 award. They got questioned by the public and the media and disability advocates. They're like, how many disabled staff you got? What's your disabled program? What's your interview program? How many disabled people you got on the board? What disabled charities are you supporting? It doesn't necessarily matter if you haven't got that in place, but you need a 3-year, 4-year plan of what you're going to do. Because there's nothing worse than brands just looking like they're jumping on a bandwagon for a one-off kind of campaign. I think the next thing, how do you bring people that aren't disabled or neurodiverse, how do you bring them into communication? And I talk about, look at what unites us. So areas like unity, decency, being kind to people, protection of one's physical, mental health, fun, honesty, fairness. And I always, when I plan diversity campaigns, I always say helicopter above into universal values, and it's much more powerful. The Maltesers was just a group of friends talking about sex. Yeah, everyone kind of does that. Paddy Power did a disability ad. It was a guy watching and enjoying football. Lots of guys do that. Amazon does this really well. So I worked on their Christmas campaign around anxiety. That was something after COVID everyone could relate to. They had the ad with the ballerina. That's childhood dreams. Everyone can relate to that. They had the imam and the priest. Everyone can relate to that. It's about sharing at a Christmas time. So helicopter into universal values, and that's much more kind of powerful. Virgin is a fantastic ad. It's probably one of my favorite ads for a long time. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a guy in a wheelchair with his girlfriend and they're dating. That tackles the myth straight away about disabled being sexual beings. It shows the sociability aspects, and it was just a really strong, powerful ad. So how do you kind of communicate disability? I think the first thing is to challenge the stereotypes. So there's general myth that all disabled are all the same. They're a burden on society, need to be pitied, treated like children, can't be a wife, mother, have sexual pleasure, can't be successful. Visually impaired, only see in darkness, all use braille, old people, can't be fashionable, independent. People talked about when I looked at myths, they can't dream, literally, people don't think, can't enjoy TV content. Hearing are the stupid, the mad, the ignorant, delicate, hearing aids always ugly, and physical impairment is the stupid. You've been in an accident, people always say, have you been in an accident? And incapable of conversation. So smashing the myths is a really important element. As I mentioned before, I think there's a really important thing to show the 3D of the person and the normalization, and not have the disability as the focus. Hard in a 30-second ad, but there's something about showing more 3D dimension of who a person is. Then some additional thoughts, go beyond the wheelchair, because a lot of people, when they think disability and they create ads, go straight to the wheelchair. Don't be too activist. Activists are fantastic, and I interview activists, but I always interview activists and then people who aren't activists, because there is a difference. And there's a difference in how they see the world and what they want out of the world. Don't shout disabled. Don't go too inspirational unless you're doing a Paralympics campaign. Be like Shrek. This works on all diversity campaigns, really, but there's the wonderful thing about Shrek is it works on multiple levels. So you've got the child and parent connection points that they both get, and then you've got the adult only jokes. Now, the best campaigns for me is a campaign that taps into unity that able-bodied people and people with disability or neurodiverse kind of connect with, but you've got the little hidden signifiers that says you really understand a person who's disabled. And it could be someone with a headphone, it could be someone with subtitles. It's just those little things that can make a difference and say you've really investigated this and you've thought about it. rather than it's an afterthought of kind of casting. Think about intersectionalities, multiple disabilities, intersectionalities coming more and more kind of prominent kind of area. If you're going to use facts, make people think, use facts that kind of jolt. Don't die by consensus. So I think if you do a campaign with disability, you're going to get criticised. If you do any diversity campaign, you're going to get criticised. The Maltesers got criticised, and it's probably the most successful disability campaign apart from the Virgin one. And it's just natural. And some of that criticism will come from people with disabilities or neurodiversity, but that's part of life because you're putting out there, you're making change. Think about the right kind of media you're kind of using. Just have kind of conversation and challenge your agencies because they won't always know what they're doing. So a little bit about research in disability. So some thoughts. So have people with disabilities on multiple kind of projects. So use people with disabilities, but you don't have to be disabled to talk to people with disabilities. You just have to be sensitive. Understand that, as hopefully you've covered here, that disability and neurodiversity, even within their categories, they're different and they have different barriers, different thoughts. This is the most important one. Interview the person, not the disability. And don't just use disabled people for projects that are about disability. It's like it's a fifth of the population. Start making sure your recruiters have got at least one person with disability, but then don't use that person to be the voice of disability. I'm sure you'll get that as well. You'll get a client and they'd be like, well, we need someone from an ethnic minority. Good. But we want you to tell them what that represents about Southeast Asian culture. You just can't do that. Yeah. So always push back. When booking a facility, so just check that it's accessible. Are there automatic doors? Will the bathroom accommodate? Are the tables high enough? You should pay them a bigger incentive because they or get a taxi for them if they can't find a parking spot or public transport. Have regular breaks because people will have low energy. If they have a carer, let them come in. If they need a sign interpreter, make it needed. Send questions in advance, especially for people that are neurodiverse, and just think about the stimulus that you're showing. So if you've got someone that's visually impaired, have a description. Yeah, you can still have it with other disabilities, but have a description and read that out. And it's just about care and sensitivity. Online, just make sure the platforms are compliant. And then just a few words on innovation, really. So people with disability are probably the greatest hackers out there because you have to constantly hack. And people with neurodiversity have to constantly hack. So you have to make adjustments all the time. And those little kind of adjustments to lives can be kind of life-changing. Get multiple perspectives, so to make sure you have different disabilities. Ideally, it's a bit expensive, but use Quant to identify some gaps. Have a small core team, innovation team. Try and deep dive, do your research before to understand the cultural and behavioural level. Get close to lived experience. I use film. And I get people to record using peak content, amazing kind of platforms. And I remember there's a lot of pushback there, like people with disabilities won't be able to do this. And you know what, the films were amazing. Yeah? So if people are really struggling, and Peak are great at having conversations with people struggling, we'll find a way that they can do it. Use the power of crowd. Co-creation is important. A lot of people think co-creation is a long process, but actually it can be a shortcut to the process because you speed things up. Don't just use people once and steal and leave. So if you set up a community, make sure you have regular conversations throughout that community all the time. Make it iterative to build on the ideas. Film is really, really powerful. Have experts in the room. So we use occupational therapists and different kind of experts as well. Have a blend. Decide whether it's universal design you're looking for, something specific to a disability, and support the charities as well, and pay people well, and you'll get good results. And that's my whirlwind tour. Any thoughts, questions?
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Steve. It was a real eye-opener. Yeah, and lots of really good things to think about. Certainly, I certainly took away an awful lot from that. Any questions from anybody?
more of an observation, really. Just the statistic that. Sorry, should I be doing it on the chat thing first, or can I just speak?
No, that's fine. Carry on.
Yeah. Just the fact that I think you said, well, 75% or 80% of people become disabled rather than starting life that way. That really struck me.
Yeah.
And also the point about communication, when you were talking about inverting the stereotype, is the way I'd sum it up. I mean, whenever I see that, it just to me smacks of tokenism, and I think you frame that in a way that is really helpful in understanding what the mistake is and how to avoid it. Yeah, and your comments about the token. I think you could almost have just changed the characters in that, and it would have sounded like a bunch of people having a chat. You know,
yeah.
That's the way to do it. Clearly.
Thank you.
Yeah. So very, very interesting, very helpful.
Lucy.
Just a question about when you said about often when children say, "What's wrong with you?"
Yeah.
You like that because it's open and refreshing. Yeah. And then later on you said often it's rude when it comes across when it's said by adults. And I don't know what the difference is there.
Yeah, I think because children are curious and they haven't been taught boundaries, so that curiosity needs to be constantly kind of increased. I think with adults, maybe the context of what I said was wrong, but with adults, it's how you say it. Mm-hmm. So often it will be a microaggression. So it will be what is wrong with you. And that's where it's kind of wrong, because you're immediately put in a power play in that position.
Right.
It's the language that people use rather than asking a question. Some people ask questions saying, "If you don't mind, could I ask you a question about your disability?" It's fine. I mean, I had a cab driver ask me yesterday. I've got no problem about having an open kind of conversation. I think it's where it comes. It's hard to explain, but it's where it comes from a position where you think that position is coming from a position of pity or power play. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's like, "You poor disabled person, what's wrong with you? I feel really sorry for you, and I really want to know." Yeah. Because it makes me feel a little bit better about myself.
Okay, thanks.
Good question.
Any other questions?
Yes. Oh,
no, carry on.
Sorry, I just jumped in. I should have asked. Yes. How do we get? How do we include disabled people in research that isn't about disability? How do we make clients aware of that as a need, and how do we make that happen?
Well, I think there's two things. A, you don't tell your clients, you just recruit them because they're part of, and you just say, well, this is the representation. You know, Theo Francis is doing fantastic stuff on that, on guinea pigs, yeah, on ethnicity. He looks at a region and just says, right, that's Newcastle, this is the makeup, this is how we're going to reflect it. And within that reflection, there should be one person with disabilities, and you just say, we're reflective of that base of that universe. So I think that's first thing. I think the second thing is the 20%. It's 20% of the population. Let's make sure we are truly being reflective here, because we might miss something. And actually, if we don't have them, we might miss a really interesting insight. But then caveat that it's not representative of the whole disability people, because that is sometimes what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously a difference between qual and quant, isn't there?
Yeah, there is.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I have lots of thoughts, but I'm going to shut up. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Thanks, Stephen. That was super interesting. And just actually building on Judith's question before, because I've been doing a lot of taste test research with kids in particular, and super keen to try and make it as inclusive as possible. But I was just wondering what your recommendations would be, because often you have the client, you know, you've got 8 very precious people who are going through the research, and they want, you know, everybody's opinion to count, and sometimes they can actually be a bit of a barrier for including people who might not be able to express themselves, you know, quite as easily, or maybe need a different kind of setup in terms of methodology. So I just wondered if you had any advice in terms of just methodological considerations to ensure inclusivity.
Yeah, I think it's about thinking about the venue where you're kind of doing it and making sure that that's accessible. I think maybe do it at different times today when people aren't busy, when people can get there, and when the transport is good. I think is a good area. I think making sure it's not too crowded, so maybe giving people selected kind of invites. So I think there's some of the things I would be kind of looking at.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Just on that point about when you talked about, I think quite early on, you talked about people asking people if they need help.
Yeah.
I thought that's quite a tricky one, I guess, because it seems like some people are going to be cross at being asked if they need help, and some people will welcome the help. I mean, where do you come out on that?
For me, it doesn't bother me. So for me, it doesn't bother me. But some people do get quite offended by it.
Yeah.
But I think it's how you phrase it, and I think it's like, would you mind if I asked you, do you need any help? Or I know some people don't always like help, and I hope you don't mind, but would you like any help? I think it's like most things. It's about the phraseology and the tone rather than anything else.
Okay, thanks.
No worries.
Joe, you have a question.
Thank you, Stephen. It was great, and I appreciate you're probably kind of coming down from adrenaline and exhausted after the presentation. So I hope this doesn't.
No, not at all. You're seeing my neurodiversity because I'm in my stepsister's house and she turns off the plug point, so I'm going to have to go upstairs.
Okay.
Because I haven't got a clue how she does it.
My question is, I really liked your point about don't let kind of campaigns die through consensus. But I guess my question is for people who are concerned about not putting a foot wrong or not offending certain groups, it can be quite intimidating when you get potentially a vocal minority disagreeing or has he gone? I think he's gone, hasn't he?
Oh gosh.
Yeah, it's okay. He'll come back on in a second.
Hopefully he'll come back in again.
Yeah, okay. I'll hold.
Your question scared him off, Joe.
Didn't mean to.
Just a quick question for those of you out there. How many of you do actually include quotas on people with disability when you're doing research, whether that be quant or qual? Is that something that's becoming more normal?
I don't. I certainly obviously wouldn't. If I was ever asked or notified that there was somebody who was relevant but had an issue of some description, I would certainly make sure they were accommodated. I think the trouble
depends on the topic. Sorry,
yeah,
John.
Well, I was just going to say, certainly, and Stephen's sort of reinforced it in what he said. It's so diverse that I'm not sure how you'd actually apply a quota, if that makes sense. I mean, might be a quota that would be particularly relevant to a subject, I suppose. So if you were doing work for TfL, maybe then you'd say physical disability is actually quite relevant. But I guess the same would be true of hearing impairment, although their announcements are usually pretty unintelligible, even if you haven't got hearing impairment.
I think the topic is obviously the crucial one.
Yes. Yeah.
I guess that because we don't put quotas on, but I would imagine that possibly I don't know how many of the recruiter databases are representative, because if you don't put a quota on, then that means we should be getting one person per group on average, or whatever it is, like 1 in 6 people who have a disability of some sort without trying to. And I suspect that we probably have fewer than that. So I assume there's an issue then amongst the, within our databases as to why aren't we getting more people with disability?
It might also. Oh, sorry.
Just to say, Steve just called me to say that he is coming back on. He's just getting himself back on. So please don't go away because he's about to come back on.
Okay.
Just building on Matt's point, I think it's really interesting. I think it makes you think actually, are disabled members of the population underrepresented on recruitment panels as well, and actually whether there is any encouragement on that side for that, or incentive for that to happen as well. And I would suspect some recruiters may shy away from that because of like legitimate.
I think we're having a few problems with your sound, Peter. I don't know if everybody else heard the end of your comment, but here's Steve coming.
I was just building. Yeah, I was just. Yeah, I'll jump off.
So I did a living example of neurodiversity at work. so there you are.
Steve, quick question for you. While you were gone, we were discussing whether or not we should start including quotas, minimum quotas on disabled people involved in all research projects, or just on certain topics. What are your thoughts on that?
I'd like to see it on all research projects. I think it's really important. I remember, and I think the recruitment companies are getting better. I mean, when I first started, they're like, "Oh, it's really difficult," and you could see their own unconscious bias coming through. But they're starting to get networks now, so I'm starting to find it much easier to kind of find people. And it's 1 in 5 people. It's like, it annoys me when people say it's difficult. I'm like, it's not. Yeah, it's like 1 in 5. You're just not working hard enough to find those people. But I would like to see quotas. I think it's really important. I think otherwise you're excluding people, and I think you're going to learn even little things like about packaging or the problems with packaging. I mean, I struggle with a lot of kind of packaging, and that's just going to take you to a new area. And it could be in a focus group and someone says, "I really struggled opening that packaging," and then an able person might say, "Actually, I find it quite difficult too." And suddenly that takes you to a really, really interesting kind of space.
Yes, I must admit there is one thing that I really don't understand is when I'm in the shower and I'm struggling to choose between conditioner or shampoo, and I can't read because I'm not wearing my glasses. Yeah. All of a sudden, I'm thinking, why don't they get people who are older than 40 years old to do some of the design on this?
Absolutely, it's a big problem. Did Joe have a question? I think it was Joe. Someone had a question, didn't they? And when I my power dropped.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, the question I was asking was around that idea of not letting things die by consensus, and for organizations that are trying to do their best and they're kind of tapping into something for maybe the first time, and they do get pushback from potentially a very vocal group, vocal minority, how to know what to take note of and what to ignore. And an example, my partner used to work for the Epilepsy Society, and they were trying to run a campaign of famous people with epilepsy, and they picked Katie Hopkins, and there was a group of the community who were like, "She can't feature in our campaigns, we don't want her." And then it was quite a struggle to know kind of who do we listen to, here. And I wondered if you had any advice on what kind of signal to noise and who to take note of and who to kind of say, "We're going with this," and
it's a really difficult question, and it's a really hard thing to navigate. I think you try and work out what the backlash might be before you put things out there. So that I'd have statements prepared in that case about why we chose Kate Hopkins, what she represents. That she represents someone with a lived experience, and we need to show that the diversity of different kind of people. I think you're always gonna get some kind of pushback, and it's a hard one to navigate. And clients clients can be very, very nervous, and sometimes it can just be one. I remember it wasn't one with disability, but I was working for Transport London, and they called me in because they were doing stuff about traffic and traffic learning, and they put a young girl in a hijab, yeah, and I think 2 people went mad, and then it got picked up, and it just escalated. But it was only 2 people, yeah, and there were cultural reasons why that's right and kind of wrong. So I think being prepared for that backlash, being strong enough to say this is what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I think the other thing is, I think if you've got a noble aim, it's hard to put it down. I think if you're doing it because you're jumping on a bandwagon, then it's a bit inauthentic. And to be honest, if you're just jumping on a bandwagon, you probably should be criticised a little bit as well.
Yeah.
You're not doing it for genuine noble reasons. And I just want to see a bit more nobility in marketing, comms, advertising anyway. And then I think the other thing in diversity is understanding your spaces. So when I worked with Mars, I went through their whole portfolio, and what we just used projectors. But it's like, if the Mars bars come alive, what's that like for the person? And it's like, well, it's cheeky, chappy, working class, happy, lively, reads the sun, etc. Perfect for male suicide, yeah, mental health, male mental health. Perfect. Galaxy was sophisticated, elegant, smooth, perfect for showing a black woman who had to match that across. Yeah, it was like Maltesers is always light touch, so everything you do is light touch. And I think that keeping those tonal values and making sure that it matches and doesn't feel too much of a misfit, what you're talking about, I think is really, really important. And don't just follow. It's just common marketing, but it really annoys me. Everyone jumps on a bandwagon and they're like, oh, I need a campaign about this because my competitors are doing it. It's like, why? Yeah, there's only one person who can really do purpose well, and that's the originator. One person might be able to do purpose another way. Not everyone has to do purpose the same kind of way. And it's interesting. I was talking to a mobile phone company the other day, and they're like, we've got a problem with our charities because we reached out to our community, and the charities we're supporting is donkey sanctuaries, and it's got a young audience. But it's got literally nothing to do with the brand. And it's like, well, step back, understand what is it they like about a donkey sanctuary. Is it because it's local? Is it because it creates a warm feeling? Just get a bit more, and that will allow you to match it. But at the moment, there's no match. So I think just more clever strategic planning is needed when you do diversity. And I think the more front end, the more research you do, the more research you do with the community. Because I think that's the other thing about the epilepsy. If they'd researched it with the community, they might have got certain kind of answers. I don't know if they did or not. So I think researching with the community is really important. Researching with the activists is important because you can kind of see the dimensions, and then you can make a call. So I'd always side with the mass rather than with the activists, but you can kind of take a call then, and you can work out if there is negativity, how to kind of handle it. So I think there's certain things. I think where it comes to problem, it's like, oh my God, we've got no disabled people in our ad. We need to get one in. Yeah. It's just shit. It's just like,
yeah. We're going to have to call it a day there.
Yeah, okay.
This discussion has been really interesting. Thank you so much for talking about that in such an open and frank way. I think it's all been very much appreciated. Anyway, thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, Steve.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.